May 21, 1943. North Atlantic Ocean. The night is silent except for the hiss of wind scraping across the frozen waves. The sea stretches endlessly, black and merciless, as temperatures hover just above freezing. On the surface, a German Type VII U-boat rises from the deep, its hull dripping salt water like sweat in the moonlight. The hatch opens with a metallic clang. Stale air rushes out, mixed with oil, diesel, and the bitter scent of men who haven't seen sunlight in days. The crew clambers up, gulping cold air, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Above them, stars flicker dimly through a haze of low clouds. They've been successful tonight. Somewhere astern, another Allied merchant ship burns, its cargo swallowed by the Atlantic. For the U-boat men, this stretch of ocean has long been theirs. The gray wolves of the Kriegsmarine, feared, undefeated, and invisible. But the war has changed. Unseen eyes now search the sea from above. A distant vibration hums through the night air. Faint at first, then sharper. Closer. The commander turns his head, frowning. That's no destroyer. It's the droning pulse of aircraft engines. Engines that should be hundreds of miles from land. Out of the mist, a shadow emerges. A flat-decked warship. On its deck, aircraft already roar to life. Above the Atlantic, the age of the hunter is ending. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Europe fell into war once again, the Atlantic Ocean quietly became one of the deadliest battlegrounds on Earth. To Britain, survival depended on the sea. Every ton of food, oil, ammunition, and machinery that kept the island alive had to cross the Atlantic. A lifeline stretching thousands of miles from North America to the ports of Liverpool, Glasgow, and Belfast. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat arm, saw opportunity in that lifeline. He believed submarines could strangle Britain into submission, cutting off its supplies faster than the Royal Navy could protect them. What began as scattered attacks in 1939 soon evolved into a coordinated campaign. The Battle of the Atlantic. In those early years, the U-boats ruled the sea. Long gray shadows moved beneath the waves, slipping silently between convoy routes. Their torpedoes struck without warning, splitting hulls in half and sending ships to the bottom within minutes. The survivors floated in freezing darkness, praying for rescue that often never came. By 1940 and 1941, Britain was on the edge of starvation. Convoys were few and unprotected, escorts limited to aging destroyers and corvettes. German submarines, the wolf packs, hunted in coordinated groups, guided by encrypted radio messages. They attacked by night, surfacing on the edges of convoys, firing multiple torpedoes before vanishing beneath the waves. Every month, more ships were lost. By 1941, over 2 million tons of Allied shipping had been sunk. Dönitz's U-boat commanders, like Günther Prien and Otto Kretschmer, became national heroes in Germany. They were celebrated in newsreels as noble predators, disciplined, fearless, and unstoppable. But beyond the propaganda, life aboard a U-boat was a slow descent into claustrophobic hell. The average patrol lasted 8 to 10 weeks. Inside the narrow steel tube, 45 men shared a space smaller than a train car. There was no privacy, little sleep, and a constant stench of oil and sweat. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. Bread molded. Fresh water was rationed. Even their air grew foul as the days passed. Yet morale remained high. For one reason: success. They believed the Atlantic was theirs. Allied ships burned faster than they could be replaced. Every victory was a message to London that Britain's sea power had finally met its match. In the winter of 1941, however, new developments began to shift the balance. The Allies introduced improved radar, high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, and more organized convoy systems. Merchant ships began to travel under the protection of naval escorts, armed with depth charges and sonar. And then, in December 1941, another event changed everything. The United States entered the war. When America joined the conflict, the Battle of the Atlantic grew wider and deadlier. The U-boats expanded their operations westward, attacking shipping off the American coast in what German crews called the Second Happy Time. Tankers burned within sight of coastal cities, but as 1942 turned to 1943, the tide of the Atlantic was preparing to turn. The Allies were learning, adapting, and building, faster than the Germans could ever imagine. And within those American shipyards, a new type of warship was taking shape, one that would bring air power to the open ocean and end the U-boat's reign beneath the waves. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered its most critical stage. Both sides understood that whoever controlled the shipping lanes would control the outcome of the war. For Britain, the convoys were a lifeline. For Germany, they were the enemy's veins to be severed. In the years since 1939, Donitz's fleet had grown from a handful of submarines to over 400 operational U-boats. Many were the advanced Type VII and Type IX models, faster, deadlier, and capable of striking deep into the Atlantic. Their coordination had become increasingly sophisticated. Germany's naval headquarters in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire directed entire packs by radio, guiding them to Allied convoys spotted by long-range aircraft or surface ships. At night, the sea turned into a hunting ground. U-boats would surface silently in the dark, their diesel engines barely audible beneath the wind. Each commander fired a spread of torpedoes into the tightly packed convoy columns. Explosions followed, fiery blossoms across the black water, and in the chaos, ships scattered, making them easier to pick off one by one. To the Allies, it felt like an invisible enemy. Destroyers and corvettes did their best, dropping depth charges where the submarines were last seen, but the U-boats often escaped. Even when hit, they might dive to the ocean floor and wait, silent, for hours until the hunt moved on. The losses were staggering. In 1942 alone, the Allies lost nearly 8 million tons of shipping, more than any other year of the war. Entire convoys vanished in the mid-Atlantic Gap, a vast stretch of ocean too far for land-based aircraft to cover. It became known to sailors as the Black Pit. The United States recognized that closing this gap was the key to turning the tide. Aircraft had proven their worth in coastal patrols, but they couldn't reach the center of the Atlantic. A new kind of ship was needed, smaller than fleet carriers, faster to build, capable of carrying just enough aircraft to defend convoys wherever they sailed. Thus emerged the Escort carrier, known to the Navy as the Baby Flat Top. Converted from merchant hulls or purpose-built in record time, these ships carried 20 to 30 aircraft, usually Grumman TBF Avengers and FM-1 Town Balaninti, Airfront-1 Wildcats. Their purpose was simple yet revolutionary: to give Allied convoys their own air cover and to hunt U-boats on the open ocean. By late 1942, the first of these ships, the USS Long Island, Bogue, and Card, began operations. At first, the U-boats were confused. They had never faced air attacks so far from land. Within months, that confusion turned to fear. The aircraft from escort carriers could spot periscopes from miles away, guided by radar and sonobuoys. When a submarine surfaced to recharge its batteries, a Wildcat or Avenger could dive from the clouds within minutes, dropping depth charges or acoustic torpedoes directly on target. And they were relentless. Unlike land-based squadrons, carrier aircraft stayed with their convoys around the clock. Even in the most remote parts of the Atlantic, the U-boats were no longer safe. For Admiral Dönitz, it was a nightmare realized. The very ocean that had been his strongest ally, vast, dark, and unguarded, was being filled with American steel and wings. The Allies were finally closing the Black Pit. By early 1943, dozens of escort carriers were entering service, supported by hundreds of new destroyer escorts equipped with sonar and radar. Convoys were no longer helpless. They were armed traps. And soon, those traps would begin to spring. For the men of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, the Atlantic was more than a battlefield. It was a proving ground of skill, endurance, and pride. They called themselves Die Grauen Wölfe, the Grey Wolves. Each patrol was a test of nerve, and each victory a confirmation of German naval genius. A typical U-boat crew numbered around 45 men. Officers, machinists, radio operators, torpedomen, and cooks, all crammed into a steel cylinder less than 220 feet long. Every inch of space was filled with machinery, weapons, and the suffocating weight of the sea. The men slept in shifts, often sharing bunks. Fresh air was scarce. Condensation dripped from the walls. The air grew foul and damp after days submerged. Despite the hardship, morale ran high. By 1941, the U-boat arm had achieved near-mythic status in Germany. Propaganda films showed heroic young captains returning from patrols, smiling beneath wreaths of oak leaves. They were seen as knights of the sea, men striking at Britain's heart while the rest of Europe bowed under German rule. Admiral Karl Dönitz, a disciplined strategist and former submariner himself, believed the U-boats could win the war alone. He envisioned hundreds of submarines operating simultaneously. A wolf pack for every convoy, overwhelming Allied defenses through coordination and numbers. In his view, the U-boat alone can bring England to her knees. For a time, it seemed he was right. Between 1940 and early 1942, Allied convoys suffered catastrophic losses. Entire columns of ships disappeared in a single night. U-boats surfaced among flaming wrecks to claim survivors, not out of mercy, but out of pride, to ask what cargo they carried, how many ships were in their convoy, and to boast that no one could save them now. From the bridge of a U-boat, the Atlantic looked endless and invincible. Each mission began in the fortified bases of Lorient or Saint-Nazaire, France. From there, crews embarked into the gray horizon, diving by day, surfacing by night, navigating only by stars and compass. Their sonar pings echoed in the darkness, a heartbeat against the silence. But that confidence began to waver as new dangers crept into the once empty skies. At first, U-boat commanders dismissed the strange reports. Aircraft sighted hundreds of miles from land, ships carrying flight decks. Some believed they were mirages or British exaggerations. Yet the losses began to mount, and the legends of invincibility began to crack. In January 1943, Dönitz received his first detailed reports. U-boats attacked by aircraft from small American carriers that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Survivors described radar-directed attacks, depth charges dropped with terrifying precision, and aircraft circling for hours as though the ocean itself had eyes. Still, German crews held faith in their doctrine. They believed their stealth, discipline, and courage would outlast Allied machines. But beneath the waves, the truth was shifting. Technology and industry were beginning to outmatch even the most seasoned hunter. And soon, those who once ruled the Atlantic would learn that the surface above them no longer belonged to them at all. While the German U-boats prowled beneath the Atlantic, the United States Navy was confronting a crisis of scale. In 1942, convoys were being torn apart faster than shipyards could replace them. The Navy had the aircraft carriers and the planes, but not in the right place, nor in the right numbers. Fleet carriers like the Enterprise and Saratoga were enormous, powerful, and costly. They were the pride of the Pacific, but they couldn't be spared for convoy duty. The Atlantic needed something smaller, cheaper, and faster to build. Something that could carry air power into the heart of the ocean. The answer came from the American shipbuilding genius that would define the war. Civilian engineers, naval architects, and industrial planners proposed converting merchant ships and tankers into small carriers. In early 1942, the first of these was launched, the USS Long Island, CVE-1. She was little more than a floating airstrip, 512 feet long, carrying just over 20 aircraft, but she represented a revolution. These new ships were dubbed escort carriers, or jeep carriers. Their mission was simple yet transformative: to bring the sky to the convoy. Where once U-boats could surface freely, now radar-equipped aircraft prowled overhead. The Grumman TBF Avenger, armed with depth charges and the new acoustic homing torpedo, could patrol hundreds of miles around its carrier. The FM-1 Wildcat, fighter guarded against long-range German reconnaissance aircraft, protecting the convoys from above. It wasn't only technology, it was organization. The U.S. Navy began forming hunter-killer groups, centered around escort carriers like the USS Bogue, USS Card, and USS Croatan, accompanied by destroyer escorts equipped with sonar and radar. Their orders were clear: find and destroy U-boats wherever they hid. Each carrier carried its own air squadron, trained specifically for anti-submarine warfare. Crews practiced night landings, coordinated radar tracking, and learned to read the étard, faintest signs on the water. An oil slick, a periscope wake, a drifting torpedo track. American innovation extended beyond the ships themselves. New devices like the Lee Light, a powerful searchlight mounted on aircraft, allowed pilots to spot surfaced U-boats in the dark and attack before they could dive. Sonobuoys were dropped to detect underwater movement. CHEV-DF stations triangulated U-boat radio transmissions, narrowing their hiding places. Every patrol became a scientific hunt, part technology, part instinct. The U.S. Navy's approach was relentless and methodical. When a U-boat was spotted, aircraft forced it underwater, draining its batteries. Destroyer escorts then moved in, sweeping with sonar, dropping depth charges in patterned intervals. One attack could last 12 hours or more, a calculated, mechanical destruction. To the Germans, it felt like the ocean itself had turned hostile. Convoys that once scattered in panic now sailed under the protective shadow of these baby carriers. The message was clear: the Atlantic was no longer their hunting ground. It was becoming a trap. By spring 1943, more than 20 escort carriers were operational. Each one multiplied the Allies' reach across the sea, shrinking the black pit day by day. The U-boats were still deadly, but now every attack carried a price. And soon, that price would become unbearable. The stage was set for the decisive confrontation. The moment when the hunters would face a new kind of enemy, armed not with depth charges alone, but with wings. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its deadliest crescendo. The Germans still believed they could turn the tide through sheer persistence. The Allies, however, had quietly assembled something new: a fusion of intelligence, radar, and relentless air power. The ocean that had once hidden the U-boats now exposed them. The month of May 1943 would later be known among U-boat crews as Der Schwarze Mai, Black May. It began with convoy ONS-5, a slow-moving formation of merchant ships sailing from Liverpool to Halifax. The convoy, protected by destroyers and corvettes, faced its first U-boat attacks in the icy waters south of Greenland. Nearly 40 submarines were waiting. For 2 nights, the Germans struck hard, sinking 13 ships and damaging several more. But this time, something was different. American and British escorts, guided by radar and sonar, counterattacked with ferocity and precision. Aircraft from nearby escort carriers circled overhead, dropping flares and depth charges into the darkness. One by one, the attackers were cornered and destroyed. By the end of the engagement, 6 U-boats were lost, many with all hands aboard. The tide had turned, not in a single battle, but through 1,000 quiet innovations coming together. Radar-equipped Avengers and Wildcats from carriers like the USS Bogue, USS Card, and USS Croatan scoured the sea for the faintest trace of a periscope. Once detected, the strike was swift. A Wildcat would dive to mark the target with tracer fire. Moments later, an Avenger would descend through cloud and fog, releasing depth charges, or the new Mark 24 Fido, the world's first acoustic homing torpedo. For the U-boat crews, there was no warning, only the scream of aircraft engines, the thundering explosion, and the crushing collapse of steel as the ocean closed in. The USS Bogue's group became legendary during this period. Under Captain Giles E. Short and later Captain J.V. Van Gallery, its aircraft and escorts sank 12 U-boats between March and December 1943, more than any other escort carrier group of the war. Gallery's tactics were revolutionary, using radar-equipped aircraft to force U-boats to dive, then deploying destroyers to destroy them once submerged. In one haunting encounter, U-569 was caught mid-recharge at night. The submarine tried to crash dive, but the Avenger above had already locked its sonar buoys. Within minutes, the U-boat was struck repeatedly by depth charges and forced to surface. The German crew scuttled their boat and surrendered, a sight unthinkable just months earlier. Similar stories echoed across the Atlantic. The Card Group under Captain Arnold J. Buster Isbell hunted aggressively along the convoy routes, often attacking multiple submarines in a single week. The Croatan, operating in the North Atlantic Gap, used radar-directed night patrols to locate wolf packs before they reached Allied convoys. Each victory was a signal. The U-boat's invisibility was gone. No longer could they surface freely to charge batteries or send reports. Every radio signal was triangulated. Every surfacing risked discovery from radar-equipped aircraft lurking beyond the clouds. Dönitz realized what was happening, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. Not yet. He ordered his captains to adapt, to fight harder, to dive deeper. But the mathematics of war had turned against him. For every U-boat Germany built, America built dozens of ships to replace those lost. For every submarine that left port, escort carriers now sailed in coordinated packs. Hunter-killer groups sweeping the sea like nets. The trap was closing. By June 1943, the Atlantic was no longer the same ocean the U-boat men had once ruled. The wolf packs, once symbols of German dominance, were now scattered, confused, and dying faster than they could be replaced. Admiral Karl Dönitz watched in disbelief as reports poured into his headquarters at Kurneval. Boats were vanishing mid-patrol without warning. Signals broke off mid-transmission. Veteran captains, men like Kretschmer and Lemp, were gone, their replacements untested and afraid. The problem wasn't courage, it was technology and the sudden precision with which the Allies now fought. American escort carriers, or jeep carriers, as crews affectionately called them, became the centerpieces of hunter-killer groups. Each carried around 20 to 30 aircraft, small in number but devastatingly effective. They no longer sailed with convoys. Instead, they hunted independently, patrolling suspected U-boat lanes, responding to ultra-decrypts, and coordinating with land-based aircraft from Newfoundland, Iceland, and the Azores. The USS Bogue Group was among the deadliest. On June 22, 1943, its aircraft detected U-527 southwest of the Azores. The submarine tried to dive, but radar held the lock. A single Avenger dropped a stick of depth charges so precisely that the U-boat broke apart underwater. All but one of her 53-man crew perished. Just days later, the Bogue's destroyer screen caught U-118 on the surface at night. The German captain fought back, firing flares and machine guns into the sky. But the returning Avengers obliterated the submarine in a blinding chain of explosions. In July, it was the Card's turn. Captain Isbell's group intercepted 3 U-boats within a week. One U-66 was cornered at dawn. As the aircraft swooped in, her commander attempted to surrender, waving a white cloth from the conning tower. But a massive secondary explosion ripped through the hull before rescue could arrive. The sea boiled, then fell silent. These engagements were more than victories. They were psychological blows. For the first time, German crews began to fear the surface, the very environment they needed to survive. Some captains refused to surface at all during daylight, causing their batteries to drain and leaving them helpless on the ocean floor. Others surfaced only at night, but the Americans had already adapted. Radar and airborne lee lights, once British innovations, now turned night into day. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence and radar coverage were closing the mid-Atlantic gap, the one region where air cover had once been impossible. With new bases in the Azores and longer-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator, the Allies could now patrol every square mile of the North Atlantic. There was nowhere left to hide. On land, Dönitz was forced to make a grim calculation. In May alone, 41 U-boats had been destroyed, over 1/4 of the entire operational fleet. Training new crews could not keep pace with the losses. By August, the once proud U-boat arm was shattered. On August 8, 1943, the Card Group destroyed U-117 as it attempted to resupply another submarine. Both were sunk. The message was unmistakable. Even refueling in mid-ocean had become a death sentence. Within weeks, Dönitz had no choice but to pull his remaining U-boats out of the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of World War II, had reached its decisive turning point. The hunters had been broken. The Atlantic, once a graveyard for Allied shipping, was now a killing ground for the men who once called it their own. When Admiral Dönitz ordered his U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic in August 1943, it marked the end of an era. For nearly 4 years, his submarines had terrorized Allied convoys, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be built. Now, in the space of a single summer, that dominance had been reversed. In May 1943 alone, what German crews later called Black May, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 submarines in just 31 days. It was an unsustainable slaughter. Every U-boat lost meant not only a destroyed vessel, but also an entire crew of trained men, 45 to 50 sailors who could not easily be replaced. The U-boat school at Flensburg worked day and night to train new crews, but the war had changed. Experience, not enthusiasm, kept men alive, and experience was dying with each sinking. The Allies, meanwhile, were refining a seamless system of detection and destruction. Escort carriers patrolled the convoy routes, while destroyers equipped with Hedgehog mortars and Aztec sonar followed up every sighting. Air patrols blanketed the ocean, guided by radar, radio intercepts, and decrypted German signals from Bletchley Park's Ultra program. For German crews, every patrol now felt like a suicide mission. The once proud Grey Wolves were forced to prowl the edges of the war, off West Africa, in the Bay of Biscay, or near Arctic convoy routes, but Allied aircraft reached even those distant waters. Radar-equipped Sunderland flying boats and Liberators could spot a periscope wake or the thin exhaust plume of a snorkel from miles away. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, U-boats had sunk over 8 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1943, that number fell to just over 2.3 million. By 1944, it dropped below 1 million. At the same time, German losses skyrocketed. Nearly 700 U-boats destroyed between 1943 and 1945. Inside the U-boat pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the mood turned grim. Crews returned home in silence, passing the empty berths of sunken comrades. Once, the pens had echoed with bands and fanfare. Now, only the thrum of engines and the smell of oil lingered. Dönitz continued to push for new technology. The Type VII electro-boot, faster and capable of longer submerged runs, but it arrived too late. The factories were bombed, the ports surrounded, and fuel scarce. The tactical revolution of 1943 had made the Atlantic a different war, one the U-boats could no longer win. For the Allies, the victory was total, but hard-earned. Over 36,000 merchant sailors had died since 1939. Entire convoys, Convoy SC-107, Convoy ONS-5, had been obliterated in earlier years. But by mid-1943, the tide had turned decisively. The flow of men, fuel, and equipment across the Atlantic surged unimpeded, paving the way for the Allied invasions of Italy and, eventually, Normandy. The United States Navy emerged from the battle transformed. In just 2 years, it had evolved from a defensive escort force into a global hunter, mastering radar, carrier aviation, and combined operations at sea. The lessons of the Atlantic would shape every American naval campaign that followed, from Leyte Gulf to Okinawa. Yet beneath the statistics and strategies, there remained a human cost, one that even victory could not erase. Thousands of young German sailors never saw land again. Their graves were not marked by headstones, but by coordinates, deep beneath the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic. By late 1944, the U-boat war had become a desperate, one-sided struggle. The once feared wolf packs were scattered into isolation, no longer hunters, but hunted survivors. Allied control of the Atlantic was now absolute. Convoys crossed from New York to Liverpool under a near-constant umbrella of radar-guided protection. What had once been a perilous 3,000-mile gauntlet was now a highway of victory. For Germany, the strategic implications were devastating. Without control of the Atlantic, the Reich was cut off from vital resources. Oil from Romania, tungsten from Spain, and supplies from Japan became unreachable. The Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht began to starve of fuel and munitions. Allied factories in the United States, operating at full power, were producing 1 Liberty ship every 42 days, a rate that dwarfed anything the U-boats could sink. The shift in the balance of power was visible even to the crews at sea, where once German sailors surfaced confidently at night, they now did so trembling, scanning the sky for the faint silhouette of a Grumman Avenger. The low hum of aircraft engines became a sound of dread, the signal of a quick, merciless end. Many U-boat men began to call the Atlantic Das große Grab, the Great Grave. In the coastal towns of France, Germany, and Norway, mothers and wives waited for letters that never arrived. Dönitz himself, hardened by decades at sea, privately admitted in his diary that the loss rate was beyond comprehension. Between 1939 and 1945, out of 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, over 30,000 never returned, a death rate of 75%, the highest of any branch in the German military. The Americans, meanwhile, had proven something far beyond numbers. Their naval ingenuity, the ability to merge aviation, radar, sonar, and cryptography into a seamless system, had changed warfare forever. Escort carriers, though small and often overlooked compared to fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown, had achieved what no battleship ever could: total control over an ocean. In post-war interviews, German survivors spoke with reluctant admiration. One recalled, They hunted us as we once hunted them. We could not see them, but they always saw us. Another wrote, "It was not bravery that kept us alive, but luck." Against such machines, courage meant nothing. In the ruins of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, Allied forces discovered half-finished submarines, new Type 21 and 23 models that might have changed the war if built earlier. But time and the relentless pace of Allied innovation had run out for Germany by May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered. Hundreds of U-boats were scuttled by their own crews rather than fall into enemy hands. The Atlantic, once echoing with the pings of sonar and the roars of depth charges, grew silent. The sea kept its secrets and its dead. Yet from that silence emerged the foundation of modern naval warfare. The lessons learned from escort carrier operations, coordination, air-sea integration, intelligence sharing, became the cornerstone of Cold War strategy. The Atlantic, once a graveyard, became a shield. A route not of fear, but of freedom. The story of the U-boat war ended not with a single battle, but with the slow, crushing realization that industrial power, innovation, and relentless resolve had triumphed over individual valor. For the men who had once ruled the depths, it was a bitter end. For the Allies, it was proof that technology, courage, and unity could turn even the darkest waters into a path toward victory. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single weapon, commander, or ship. It was won by persistence, the tireless collaboration of sailors, scientists, and engineers across thousands of miles of ocean. From the steel decks of escort carriers to the radar rooms of Newfoundland and the code-breaking halls of Bletchley Park, the Allied victory was a triumph of coordination. Every new piece of technology, radar, sonar, cryptography, airborne depth charges, became another thread in a vast, invisible web that tightened around the German U-boats. For the Americans, the battle marked the true coming of age of a global navy. The once modest escort carriers, born out of necessity and built in converted merchant hulls, had reshaped maritime warfare. They proved that sea control no longer depended on the biggest guns or the thickest armor, but on information, mobility, and the reach of aircraft. For the German sailors, it was a tragedy of devotion and futility. They fought with courage in an unwinnable war, their loyalty consumed by the machinery of a doomed empire. The ocean became both their battlefield and their grave, a silent monument to courage without victory. Today, the wrecks of hundreds of U-boats still lie scattered across the Atlantic seabed, untouched, sealed in darkness. They are the last witnesses to a struggle that decided the fate of continents. And above those waters, ships still pass freely, protected by the very lessons learned from that long, bitter war beneath the waves.